They didn't lower their voices when they talked about him. They didn't need to. To them, he was already invisible. His chest had been taken, his name crossed out with a red marker that bled through the paper, and the chair he'd used for years was pushed aside, as if it had never belonged to anyone. A supervisor laughed softly and said it was nothing personal, while others avoided eye contact, pretending to scroll through their phones. He stood there holding a thin envelope that felt heavier than it should have, listening as his worth was reduced to a line item that no longer fit the budget. No one noticed how straight his back remained, or how his hands stayed steady. They only saw a burden being removed, and they felt relieved. What none of them realized was that this moment was not as small as it seemed. While judgments were passed and signatures rushed across paper, someone else was watching from the corner of the room, dressed plainly, saying nothing, absorbing every detail. The smiles, the indifference, the quiet cruelty, disguised as procedure. His eyes lingered on the man with the envelope, not with pity, but with recognition. There was a reason he had chosen to be there that day, a reason he hadn't interrupted, a reason he allowed the injustice to unfold exactly as it did. And when the doors finally closed behind the discarded man, the balance of that place had already begun to shift, though no one yet understood why. His name was Frank Harlan, and for most of the people who passed him in the corridor every morning, he was not a person so much as a move-in, part of the building one more quiet function that kept the place running without ever asking to be seen. He wasn't loud. He didn't linger in conversations. He had the kind of face that looked like it had learned patience the hard way, the kind of eyes that watched more than they demanded. If you asked anyone up on the executive floors who Frank was, they would give you a vague answer. The way you describe something you assume will always be there. Maintenance, facilities, the older guy with the cart. Frank didn't correct them. He arrived early, before the elevators filled with cologne and urgency, before the lobby turned into a stage for polished shoes and confident laughter. He moved through the building with a practiced rhythm, fixing what broke, cleaning what others left behind, replacing what no one thanked him for replacing. He knew the small truths of the place, which doors stuck in winter, which ceiling tiles hid the faint smell of a past leak, which conference room always left coffee rings like careless signatures. He knew people by their habits more than their names. The ambitious ones walked fast and never looked down. The anxious ones checked their phones like they were holding their own pulse in their hands. The kind ones there were a few would nod, sometimes smile, and keep going. Frank didn't need applause. He had spent a lifetime learning the weight of things that never made headlines. At home, his world was smaller and quieter. A modest house that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old wood. A worn recliner that remembered the shape of him. A kitchen table with one chair that had been pushed in and out for years, always by the same hands. On the wall, there was a framed photograph of a young woman in a graduation cap, his daughter smiling, in a way that still hurt to look at too long. Not because the memory was cruel, but because it was precious, and precious things made you careful. Frank carried that photo inside him the way some people carried prayers. He wasn't weak. He was simply disciplined enough not to perform his pain for an audience. And that was what made the moment in the office so grotesque. Because when the envelope was placed in his hands and his badge was stripped away like a costume no longer needed, it wasn't only a job they were taking. It was the last, clean routine of his days. The last place where his presence, however ignored still, meant something to the structure of the world. Frank looked at the red line through his name on the paper and felt the familiar pressure of humiliation trying to rise, trying to turn into anger, trying to demand a scene. But he didn't give them that. He held the envelope the way you hold something fragile. Not because it mattered, but because he did. His posture stayed steady. His voice stayed level when he thanked them, even as their faces showed confusion at the courtesy. He didn't beg. He didn't plead his case like a man trying to prove he deserved air. He simply nodded once, as if acknowledging an unpleasant truth about the weather, and turned toward the door with a kind of calm that made the cruelty in the room feel even uglier. And as he walked out, he didn't have noticed that someone's gaze followed him with the patience of a man who understood exactly what was being stolen, and exactly how easily it could be returned. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment. And if you believe quiet dignity still matters in a loud world, subscribe. These stories exist because someone chooses to listen. The building itself liked to pretend it was neutral. Glass, steel, polished stone, everything designed to suggest efficiency without emotion, progress without consequence. From the outside, it rose cleanly against the skyline, a monument to modern order. Inside, it functioned like a quiet hierarchy disguised as routine. Every floor had its purpose, every badge its color, every voice its permitted volume. Power didn't announce itself here. It hummed softly through access codes, closed-door meetings, and calendars booked weeks in advance. On the lower floors, the work was practical and physical. People kept things running, fixed what failed, cleaned what was ignored. They were necessary, but never central. Their names didn't appear in company newsletters. Their opinions didn't shape strategy. They were spoken to politely when needed, and forgotten immediately after. The system rewarded visibility, not usefulness. Above them, the air subtly changed. The executive level smelled different leather, espresso, expensive restraint. Offices widened. Windows stretched. Conversations slowed down just enough to sound important. Here, decisions were made with language that softened their impact. Restructuring, optimization, realignment, words that carried no faces, no families, no consequences, at least not on paper. The people who held authority believed deeply in process, especially when process absolved them of responsibility. Human resources sat at the center of this illusion of fairness. NeutralWalls.com voices. Policy stacked neatly in binders, like moral alibis. It was where empathy went to be formalized and quietly no one raised their voice there. No one had to. The rules spoke loudly enough on their behalf. That morning, the office buzzed with a restrained tension that came from deadlines and ambition colliding. Emails flew. Phones vibrated. Managers moved with purpose, rehearsing conversations they would later pretend were spontaneous. The decision about Frank had already been made long before he was called in. His presence was procedural, his silence inconvenient to the people in charge. This was a necessary correction. A cost trimmed, a line adjusted. They spoke about longevity as if it were a liability, about age as if it were an efficiency made visible. No one said these things directly, but the implication sat comfortably in the room. Experience didn't scale. Loyalty didn't innovate, and dignity had no measurable return. What made the environment truly corrosive wasn't cruelty, it was comfort. The comfort of believing the system was fair because it followed rules. The comfort of thinking injustice only happened when someone broke them. Everyone involved that day would later tell themselves the same story. This is just how it works. It's unfortunate, but it's not personal. They didn't see the contradiction in that sentence. Because while the building presented itself as orderly and impartial, it thrived on an unspoken agreement. Those at the top would never have to look too closely at the cost of their decisions, and those below would learn to endure quietly. The system didn't require malice. It only required compliance. And as Frank stepped out into the hallway, badge gone. Footsteps echoing softly against the polished floor. The machine continued running exactly as designed, unaware that somewhere within its flawless logic, a variable had just entered that would force it to confront itself. The first signs had been subtle, almost polite, in their cruelty. Frank noticed them, not all at once, but the way you notice a draft in a familiar room only after IT's been there long enough to change the temperature. It started with the smallest shifts, things easy to dismiss if you weren't paying attention. A work order reassigned, without explanation. A meeting he'd always been told to attend, quietly removed from his schedule. His name missing from an internal email where it had appeared for years, replaced by a generic line that read, "Facilities will handle it." Facilities. As if it were a machine and not a man. He adapted the way he always had. He asked fewer questions. He waited longer for instructions. When he passed supervisors in the hall, their greetings shortened, their eyes sliding past him toward more urgent destinations. Conversations stopped when he approached. Not abruptly, but with a gentle awkwardness that suggested he no longer belonged inside them. No one was rude. That was the clever part. Rudeness could be confronted. This was something else on erasure and progress. Even his tools began to disappear. A ladder relocated without notice. A cart reassigned. Once, he found a lock on a storage room he'd had access to for over a decade. He stood there for a moment, key in hand, staring at the unfamiliar shine of the metal, feeling something tighten in his chest. Not anger. Recognition. The kind that comes when you realize decisions have been made about you in rooms you were never invited into. There were comments too, disguised as concern. A manager asking if the work was getting a little heavy these days. Someone else suggesting maybe it was time Frank thought about slowing down. The words were soft, but they landed with weight. They weren't questions. They were rehearsals. Frank answered the same way each time. With courtesy, with calm. He didn't defend his efficiency or list the things he'd fixed that no one else even knew were broken. He didn't remind them that the building still stood on routines he'd dememorized long before they arrived. He simply nodded, thanked them for their concern, and kept moving. What hurt most wasn't the inconvenience. It was the assumption, the unspoken agreement that he would accept being phased out quietly, gratefully, without making anyone uncomfortable, that he would understand his own diminishing relevance and cooperate with it. On the day before everything ended, he overheard two supervisors near the elevators. They didn't see him at first, and when they did, it was already too late to pull the words back. "He's been here forever," one said, lowering his voice too late. "Yeah," the other replied. "But that's kind of the problem." They laughed, not cruelly, not loudly, just enough to share the relief of saying it out loud. Frank didn't react. He waited for the elevator doors to close before exhaling slowly through his nose. His reflection stared back at him in the mirrored walls older. Yes, but steady, capable, still useful, even if usefulness no longer mattered to the people who decided such things. That was when he understood, not emotionally, but structurally. He wasn't being evaluated. He was being replaced in advance. And somewhere, watching these small rehearsals of disregard with careful attention, a man who appeared to have no stake in any of this was already taking notes in silence. The building itself liked to pretend it was neutral. Glass, steel, polished stone, everything, designed to suggest efficiency without emotion, progress without consequence. From the outside, it rose cleanly against the skyline, a monument to modern order. Inside, it functioned like a quiet hierarchy disguised as routine. Every floor had its purpose, every badge its color, every voice its permitted volume. Power didn't announce itself here. It hummed softly through access codes, closed-door meetings, and calendars booked weeks in advance. On the lower floors, the work was practical and physical. People kept things running, fixed what failed, cleaned what was ignored. They were necessary, but never central. Their names didn't appear in company newsletters. Their opinions didn't shape strategy. They were spoken to politely when needed, and forgotten immediately after. The system rewarded visibility, not usefulness. Above them, the air subtly changed. The executive level smelled different leather, espresso, expensive restraint. Offices widened. Windows stretched. Conversations slowed down just enough to sound important. Here, decisions were made with language that softened their impact. Restructuring, optimization, realignment, words that carried no faces, no families, no consequences, at least not on paper. The people who held authority believed deeply in process, especially when process absolved them of responsibility. Human resources sat at the center of this illusion of fairness. Neutralwalls.com voices. Policies stacked neatly in binders, like moral alibis. It was where empathy went to be formalized and quietly No one raised their voice there. No one had to. The rules spoke loudly enough on their behalf. That morning, the office buzzed with a restrained tension that came from deadlines and ambition colliding. Emails flew. Phones vibrated. Managers moved with purpose, rehearsing conversations they would later pretend were spontaneous. The decision about Frank had already been made long before he was called in. His presence was procedural, his silence inconvenient. To the people in charge, this was a necessary correction, a cost trimmed, a line adjusted. They spoke about longevity as if it were a liability, about age as if it were an efficiency made visible. No one said these things directly, but the implication sat comfortably in the room. Experience didn't scale, loyalty didn't innovate, and dignity had no measurable return. What made the environment truly corrosive wasn't cruelty, yet was comfort. The comfort of believing the system was fair because it followed rules. The comfort of thinking injustice only happened when someone broke them. Everyone involved that day would later tell themselves the same story. This is just how it works. It's unfortunate, but it's not personal. They didn't see the contradiction in that sentence, because while the building presented itself as orderly and impartial, it thrived on an unspoken agreement. Those at the top would never have to look too closely at the cost of their decisions, and those below would learn to endure quietly. The system didn't require malice. It only required compliance. And as Frank stepped out into the hallway, badge gun footsteps echoing softly against the polished floor, the machine continued running exactly as designed, unaware that somewhere within its flawless logic a variable had just entered that would force it to confront itself. The first signs had been subtle, almost polite, in their cruelty. Frank noticed them not all at once, but the way you notice a draft in a familiar room, only after IT has been there long enough to change the temperature. It started with the smallest shifts. Things easy to dismiss if you weren't paying attention. A work order reassigned without explanation. A meeting he'd always been told to attend quietly removed from his schedule. His name missing from an internal email where it had appeared for years, replaced by a generic line that read, "Facilities will handle it." Facilities. As if it were a machine and not a man. He adapted the way he always had. He asked fewer questions. He waited longer for instructions. When he passed supervisors in the hall, their greetings shortened, their eyes sliding past him toward more urgent destinations. Conversations stopped when he approached, not abruptly, but with a gentle awkwardness that suggested he no longer belonged inside them. No one was rude. That was the clever part. Rudeness could be confronted. This was something else, an erasure in progress. Even his tools began to disappear. A ladder relocated without notice. A cart reassigned. Once, he found a lock on a storage room he'd had access to for over a decade. He stood there for a moment, key in hand, staring at the unfamiliar shine of the metal, feeling something tighten in his chest. Not anger. Recognition. The kind that comes when you realize decisions have been made about you in rooms you were never invited into. There were comments too, disguised as concern. A manager asking if the work was getting a little heavy these days. Someone else suggesting maybe it was time. Frank thought about slowing down. The words were soft, but they landed with weight. They weren't questions. They were rehearsals. Frank answered the same way, each time. With courtesy. With calm. He didn't defend his efficiency or list the things he'd fixed that no one else even knew were broken. He didn't remind them that the buildings too stood on routines he'd memorized long before they arrived. He simply nodded, thanked them for their concern, and kept moving. What hurt most wasn't the inconvenience. It was the assumption, the unspoken agreement that he would accept being phased out quietly, gratefully, without making anyone uncomfortable, that he would understand his own diminishing relevance and cooperate with it. On the day before everything ended, he overheard two supervisors near the elevators. They didn't see him at first, and when they did, it was already too late to pull the words back. "He's been here forever," one said, lowering his voice too late. "Yeah," the other replied, "but that's kind of the problem." They laughed, not cruelly, not loudly, just enough to share the relief of saying it out loud. Frank didn't react. He waited for the elevator doors to close before exhaling slowly through his nose. His reflection stared back at him in the mirrored walls older. Yes, but steady. Capable, still useful, even if usefulness no longer mattered to the people who decided such things. That was when he understood, not emotionally, but structurally. He wasn't being evaluated, he was being replaced in advance, and somewhere, watching these small rehearsals of disregard with careful attention, a man who appeared to have no stake in any of this was already taking notes in silence. He didn't look like someone who mattered. That was the point. The man had been sitting quietly near the back of the room during the meeting, positioned just far enough from the table to be ignored without effort. He wore a plain gray jacket, slightly worn at the cuffs, and shoes that had seen enough use to suggest practicality over status. No watch that caught the light. No phone laid face up, on the table, demanding attention. If anyone had bothered to ask who he was, they would have assumed he was an external consultant, or perhaps someone from compliance present, but irrelevant. No one asked. He had arrived early that morning, signing in with minimal conversation, declining coffee, choosing his seat with intention. From there, he observed the building the way a physician observes a patient, noting symptoms rather than appearances. He noticed how Isalai people dismissed those they believed held no leverage, how politeness dissolved the moment usefulness was questioned, how cruelty, when filtered through policy, became almost invisible. His eyes returned often to Frank. Not out of pity, out of recognition. When the envelope slid across the table, the man's expression didn't change, but something behind his gaze sharpened. He watched the supervisors carefully, memorizing their phrasing, their posture, the way they avoided responsibility by hiding behind neutral language. He listened not only to what they said, but to what they assumed would never be challenged. This was not the first time he had seen such a moment. It was simply one of the clearest. He didn't interrupt, he didn't clear his throat, or shift in his chair to draw attention. Intervention would have spoiled the truth. People behaved most honestly when they believed no one powerful was watching. When Frank thanked him and stood to leave, the man followed him with his eyes until the door closed. Only then did he look down at the notepad resting on his knee. It contained no company logos, no official letter, had just a few neat lines of handwriting. Names, times, phrases quoted exactly as spoken. Evidence, not of a legal violation, but of a moral one. If someone had asked him why he was there, he would have given a simple answer, that he was reviewing internal culture, that he liked to see how policies were applied on the ground. Both statements would have been true. Neither would have revealed the full picture. Because in reality, the man had built his life on understanding systems of how they grew, how they hid their failures, and how easily they mistook silence for consent. He had learned that power did its most honest work when disguised as normalcy, that justice, when delivered properly, didn't need spectacle. As he stood and slipped the notepad into his jacket, no one stopped him. No one wondered who he was or why he'd been there. He walked out the same doors Frank had used minutes earlier, blending into the rhythm of the building as if he belonged nowhere in particular. Yet everything about his presence had been intentional, and as he stepped into the hallway, already planning his next move, one thing was clear in his mind. The man who had just been dismissed was not alone in what had been taken from him, and the people who believed they were untouchable had just been seen far more clearly than they realized. Their paths crossed without ceremony, without introduction. In a place so ordinary, it almost erased the significance of the moment. The hallway near the service elevator smelled faintly of cleaning solution and old carpet, the kind of space designed to move people through rather than invite them to stay. Frank had paused there briefly, adjusting the envelope under his arm, grounding himself before stepping fully back into the world. That was when he sensed someone beside him. The man stood at a respectful distance, not invading his space, not pretending not to notice him either. There was no pity in his expression, no curiosity sharpened by gossip, just a calm awareness, as if he understood exactly what had just happened without needing it explained. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Silence settled between them, not awkward, but deliberate. "Rough meeting," the man said finally, his voice even, unassuming. Frank glanced at him, surprised not by the comment, but by the absence of judgment behind it. He nodded once. "It happens," he replied. Most people would have filled the space after that, rushed to offer comfort or advice. This man didn't. He accepted the answer as complete. That alone created a kind of trust, small, fragile, but real. They began walking in the same direction without discussing it. Two men moving toward the exit at the same pace, their steps briefly aligned. They spoke of nothing important. The weather, the building. How long Frank had worked there? The man listened more than he spoke, asking questions that didn't pry, allowing pauses to breathe. When Frank mentioned the years he'd spent keeping the place together, the man nodded slowly, as if filing the information somewhere that mattered. There was no sympathy in his eyes, only respect. At the doors, Frank stopped. The city waited beyond the glass, loud and indifferent. He turned slightly toward the man, unsure why he felt the need to say anything at all. "Most people don't notice," Frank said, gesturing vaguely back toward the building. "When things stop working, they just expect it to be fixed." The man met his gaze. "The best systems rely on people they forget to thank," he replied. It wasn't a grand statement. It wasn't meant to be, but it landed with unexpected weight. Frank studied him for a second longer, seeing something beneath the plain clothes and quiet tone, a depth shaped by experience, not theory. Someone who had seen the cost of invisibility and chosen to remember it. They shook hands, briefly. The man's grip was firm, not dominant. "Equal. My name's David," he said. "Frank, no titles, no explanations." They parted without exchanging numbers, without promises. Frank stepped outside and moved toward the bus stop. David remained inside for a moment, watching through the glass as Frank took his place among strangers. There was something about the way Frank stood steady, unbowed, that stayed with him. As David finally turned away, one thought settled clearly in his mind. Some connections didn't need to be maintained to matter. Some only needed to be witnessed at the right moment. And this one had been... The system didn't stop with Frank's dismissal. It really did. Once it decided someone was expendable, it moved with a kind of quiet momentum, rewriting reality to justify itself. Within days, his absence was treated not as a loss, but as a correction. Tasks he used to handle were distributed hastily, poorly, among people already stretched thin. Problems began to surface, minor at first, then increasingly visible, but the narrative had already been set. Any disruption was framed as a temporary adjustment, not a consequence. Emails circulated, carefully worded, announcing operational improvements. Frank's name was never mentioned. History was edited in real time. New contractors were brought in at higher cost, their lack of familiarity excused as part of innovation. When things broke that Frank would have fixed quietly, they became line items and meeting agendas. The irony went unnoticed. More troubling was what followed on a personal level. A delay in his final paycheck, blamed on processing, conflicting information about his benefits, a form sent twice, then not at all. Each interaction required him to explain himself to someone new, someone younger, someone trained to see cases instead of people. None of it was overtly hostile. That was what made it exhausting. Injustice delivered in pieces was easier to deny. Frank handled it the same way he handled everything else. He waited on hold without complaint. He took notes. He followed instructions even when they contradicted each other. When he visited the office in person to resolve an issue, he stood at the edge of the lobby, unbadged now, visibly out of place. The receptionist spoke to him kindly, But with distance, a manager passed by and hesitated, then offered a tight smile that carried more discomfort than warmth. Inside, whispers had begun. Some said Frank had been slow. Others sighed resisted change. The truth didn't matter. The story only needed to be believable enough to protect those who told it. When someone asked why a man with his tenure had been let go so abruptly, the answer was always the same. It was handled properly. Frank overheard pieces of this when he returned to drop off his final equipment. He didn't correct anyone. He didn't defend himself against a narrative designed to erase him. He collected his belongings, signed where he was told, and left without comment. The door closed behind him with a finality that echoed longer than it should have. What no one inside the building knew was that the same system escalating its quiet cruelty was now under observation. Not from regulators. Not from auditors. From someone who understood that patterns revealed more than incidents. David had been making calls. Not in anger, but with precision. He asked questions that sounded casual but weren't. He requested reports that hadn't been reviewed in years. He listened. The deeper he looked, the clearer it became. Frank's dismissal wasn't an exception. It was a symptom. Others like him had been phased out the same way older employees, long tenured, quietly removed under the banner of efficiency. Each case defensible on its own. Together, unmistakable. The injustice wasn't loud enough to provoke outrage. It didn't need to be. It thrived in moderation, in plausibility, in the absence of witnesses who mattered. But now there was one, and as the system continued to tighten around people like Frank, confident in its own justification, it failed to notice that the silence it relied on had shifted from acceptance to record, from endurance to reckoning. Time began to stretch in unfamiliar ways for Frank. Days that had once been shaped by routine now opened wide, unstructured, forcing him to decide who he was without the quiet certainty of work. He filled the mornings, carefully fixing small things around the house, walking the neighborhood, keeping his hands busy so his thoughts wouldn't wander too far ahead. Outwardly, nothing about him suggested urgency. Inwardly, questions pressed softly but persistently, like a tide testing the shoreline. He waited. Not in hope, exactly. More in awareness. Something about the way events had unfolded left a faint, unsettled feeling in him, as if the story hadn't reached its natural conclusion. The meeting, the man in the hallway, the look in his eyes. Frank didn't dwell on it, but he didn't dismiss it either. Experience had taught him that meaning often arrived quietly, disguised as coincidence. Inside the company, tension brewed in a different form. Problems multiplied. Systems failed in ways that exposed how much knowledge had walked out the door with people like Frank. Managers grew defensive. Meetings stretched longer. Emails carried sharper edges beneath their polished language. There was talk of external reviews, of leadership alignment, of ensuring compliance. The tone had changed from confidence to containment. No one connected these developments to Frank. That would have required acknowledgement. Instead, they waited for the storm to pass, convinced that whatever scrutiny had begun would remain superficial. Systems built on quiet injustice often believed they were too boring to be challenged. David waited. From his perspective, patience was not restraint, it was leverage. He allowed the tension to rise naturally, to reveal fault lines. He watched how people behaved when they thought they were being observed, and how differently they behaved when they believed the observer had moved on. He said very little, asked for very little, and received far more than he needed. Frank received a letter in the mail one afternoon, plain envelope, company logo in the corner. For a moment, his pulse quickened not with fear, but curiosity. Inside was a brief notice requesting his availability for a follow-up conversation regarding recent procedural concerns. No apology, no explanation, just a date and time. He folded the letter carefully and placed it on the table beside the photograph of his daughter. He sat there for a long moment, stewing, but whatever was coming, he would meet it the same way he had met everything else, with composure. He did not rehearse speeches. He did not imagine vindication. He prepared only to tell the truth, if asked. On the scheduled day, Frank dressed neatly and left the house with the same calm deliberation he always carried. He didn't know who would be on the other side of that conversation. He didn't know what they wanted. He only knew that the silence which had once isolated him now felt charged, as if it were holding something back. And somewhere not far away, David reviewed a final set of documents, his expression unreadable, fully aware that the moment for observation was ending and the moment for action was about to begin. The first sign that something had shifted came quietly, almost politely, the way real power often announced itself. There were no dramatic confrontations, no sudden firings, no rumors loud enough to travel quickly. Instead, calendars changed. Meetings were rescheduled, without explanation. A few senior managers were asked to provide documentation they hadn't reviewed in years. Requests came from an unfamiliar name, attached to an email signature that revealed very little. David Mercer, no title listed, no department specified. That omission unsettled people more than a bold declaration would have. Assistants hesitated before replying. Executives forwarded messages up the chain, looking for reassurance that never came. When someone finally asked who David Mercer was, the answer varied depending on who was asked. Some thought he was external counsel. Others assumed he was part of a board initiative. No one admitted they didn't know, and no one truly did. Frank noticed the change only indirectly. The follow-up meeting he'd been summoned to was postponed twice, then cancelled entirely. In its place, he received a call from a calm, professional voice, asking if he would be willing to answer a few questions for clarity. There was no pressure in the request, no implication of obligation. The tone alone suggested a shift in footing. He agreed. The questions were precise, not accusatory, not sympathetic. They focused on processes, patterns, timing. Frank answered honestly, sticking to what he knew, what he'd seen, what he'd experienced. No embellishment and no bitterness. On the other end of the line, the listener took notes, without interruption. When the call ended, Frank sat quietly for a moment, phone still in his hand. He felt no triumph, no relief, just a sense that his words had finally landed somewhere they would be held carefully. Inside the company, the atmosphere tightened further. An internal review was announced routine, the memo claimed. But routines didn't usually involve board-level visibility or sudden interest in long-ignored departments. Files were requested, metrics re-evaluated, patterns cross-referenced. People who had once spoken confidently about policy now chose their words with new caution. The supervisor who had led Frank's dismissal found himself called into multiple meetings, each one framed as collaborative, each one quietly dismantling the certainty he'd relied on. Decisions he'd made without hesitation were now being questioned not for legality, but for judgment. No one raised their voice. No one needed to. David remained invisible, yet unmistakably present. His influence was felt in the pauses before people answered, in the careful phrasing of internal messages, in the sudden realization that someone was listening who did not need to announce himself. He didn't correct the system publicly. He allowed it to confront its own reflection. Frank went back to his routines at home, unaware of the specifics, but sensing they change all the same. The world around him felt slightly rebalanced, as if a weight had been shifted off-center. He didn't claim credit for it. He didn't expect gratitude. He simply continued living with the same measured dignity he always had. What neither side fully understood yet was that this was only the beginning. The first adjustment, the quiet clearing of the throat before the truth was finally spoken aloud. The revelation did not arrive with an announcement. There was no dramatic unveiling, no moment where doors burst open or voices rose to command attention. It came the way gravity makes itself known, not by noise, but by inevitability. The boardroom was full that morning, more so than usual. Senior executives took their seats with practiced composure, though something in the air felt different. The agenda had been circulated late the night before, sparse in detail, marked only as a strategic review. No one questioned it openly, but conversations before the meeting were unusually careful. People sensed they were no longer fully in control of the narrative. David entered last. He didn't rush. He didn't wait to be acknowledged. He took an empty seat near the center of the table, placed a slim folder in front of him, and folded his hands. Only then did he look around the room, meeting each pair of eyes calmly, without challenge or warmth. Some recognized him immediately. The quiet man from the review emails, the name that had unsettled him, but others did not. And that uncertainty showed. He began speaking without introduction. For the past several months, Said Ebenly, I've been observing how this organization applies its stated values in practice. A few people shifted in their chairs. He spoke about patterns, not incidents, about turnover among long-tenured employees, about the language used in internal communications when discussing age, cost, and relevance. He quoted phrases verbatim, not accusingly, but accurately. Each one landed with uncomfortable precision. He referenced decisions made in rooms just like this one, framed as efficiency, executed as erasure. Then he opened the folder. Inside were timelines, summaries, documented testimonies quietly gathered, meticulously aligned. Frank's case was there, but it was not isolated. It was contextualized, one thread in a fabric that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Finally, someone interrupted, voice tight. And who exactly are you to be conducting this kind of review? David looked at him, not with irritation, but with mild curiosity, as if the question itself had arrived late. "My name is David Mercer," he said. "I am the majority stakeholder of the parent firm that acquired this company 3 years ago." Silence followed, not the awkward kind, but the stunned variety that recalibrates reality and let it sit. "I founded the investment group that holds your operating capital. I sit on the board you report to, though I rarely attend meetings. I prefer to understand organizations before I speak within them." No one spoke. Some faces drained of color, others fixed into rigid neutrality, scrambling internally to reorder everything they thought they knew. "I was raised by a man who worked maintenance in a place much like this," David continued, his tone unchanged. "He kept systems alive that never knew his name. When he was let go, it was handled properly too." The room stayed still. I wanted to see whether we had learned anything since then. He did not accuse anyone of malice. He did not threaten. He simply outlined consequences measured, precise, already approved. Leadership changes, policy revisions, independent oversight, a restructuring not of personnel alone, but of accountability. Each decision presented as final, not punitive, but corrective. "This is not about revenge," David said. "It's about alignment. Organizations become dangerous when they forget who they depend on." The meeting ended shortly after. No applause, no argument. People left quietly, some shaken, some reflective, all aware that something fundamental had shifted. Later that afternoon, Frank received a call. David's voice was the same as it had been in the hall welcome. Respectful. "I wanted you to hear it from me," he said. "What happened to you mattered." Frank listened, absorbing the truth, not with disbelief, but with a slow, steady understanding. He thanked David, not for the action, but for the recognition. When the call ended, Frank sat in silence for a long time, not overwhelmed, not vindicated. Who's groomed justice, he realized, didn't need to raise its voice. It only needed someone willing to see clearly and act accordingly. The consequences unfolded without spectacle, just as the revelation had. There were no public statements crafted for damage control, no dramatic firings announced in press releases. Instead, changes arrived quietly, but they arrived everywhere. The system corrected itself the way a body does after recognizing an illness slowly at first, then with unmistakable intention. Several senior managers were reassigned within weeks, their authority redistributed, their decision-making now subject to review rather than assumption. Policies once treated as suggestions were rewritten with clarity that left little room for interpretation. Terms like optimization and realignment were replaced with language that acknowledged impact, not just outcome. Accountability was no longer theoretical. An independent oversight committee was established, its mandate simple and inconvenient: to listen. Anonymous reporting channels were expanded. Exit interviews, once ceremonial, were taken seriously. Patterns that had lived comfortably in silence were now documented, tracked, and confronted. The organization didn't collapse under the weight of these changes. For those still inside, the shift was unsettling. The absence of fear-based efficiency felt unfamiliar. Meetings became quieter, more deliberate. People spoke more carefully, not because they were afraid, but because they understood they were being heard. Power, once concentrated and unexamined, had been redistributed into responsibility. Frank's case was addressed directly. His benefits were restored retroactively, the delays acknowledged without excuses. A formal letter arrived, signed not by Human Resources, but by the board itself, recognizing his years of service in language that finally reflected reality. It didn't ask for forgiveness. It didn't offer justification. It simply stated the truth that should have been obvious all along. He was offered his position back. Frank read the letter slowly. Once, then again. The offer was sincere. The terms were fair. There was even an additional role proposed advisory, if he chose it, recognizing his institutional knowledge. It was everything a vindicated man might want. He declined. Not out of pride. Out of clarity. He replied with a brief note, handwritten, thanking them for the correction, and wishing them well in their efforts to do better. He explained that he had already begun building a different rhythm for his life, one that no longer depended on systems that had once forgotten him. His dignity did not require reinstatement. It required acknowledgement, and that had been given. David respected the decision. In fact, he expected it. The changes continued long after Frank's name faded from internal memos. What remained was the understanding that quiet people were no longer invisible by default, that silence did not imply consent, that systems, when observed honestly, could still be corrected without being destroyed. And for the first time in a long while, the building stood not just as a monument to efficiency, but as a reminder that justice, when done properly, left no scars, only balance. Frank's days settled into a quieter shape, one not defined by alarms or schedules pinned to someone else's priorities. Mornings came with soft light through the kitchen window, the kind that didn't rush him. He fixed things when they needed fixing, not because it was expected, but because it was who he was. A loose hinge, a neighbor's broken step, small acts that carried no recognition, and therefore required none. The photograph of his daughter remained on the wall, unchanged, but it felt different now. Not lighter, truer. He had lived in a way she would have recognized, steady, decent, unwilling to trade his dignity for approval. That mattered more to him than any title ever had. He thought occasionally about the building, about the people still moving through its corridors. He didn't harbor resentment. Resentment required an ongoing relationship with injustice, and that chapter was closed. What remained was something quieter and stronger. Respect for himself, earned without applause. David, for his part, never spoke publicly about what he'd done. There was no benefit in being praised for correcting something that should never have existed. He continued to move through systems the same way he always had lived, watching, intervening only when silence had been mistaken for consent. The world didn't need more loud heroes. It needed fewer quiet failures. Frank and David never met again. They didn't need to. Their connection had served its purpose, intersecting briefly to remind a system and perhaps themselves that worth was not determined by visibility, and power did not have to announce itself to be absolute. Justice had arrived not as punishment, but as restoration. On a late afternoon walk, Frank paused at a crosswalk as the light changed. Cars stopped. The city waited. For a moment, everything was balanced motion, held in check by mutual agreement. He stepped forward calmly when the signal allowed, moving with the confidence of someone who knew his place in the world had never been up for debate. Some people pass through life believing silence means weakness. Others learn, too late, that it is often the strongest proof of who truly holds power. If you've ever been treated this way or witnessed someone being quietly pushed aside, share it in the comments. And if stories like this matter to you, consider subscribing. Some experiences deserve to be acknowledged.